Hi, welcome everybody to tonight's meeting about on-street parking. We have one person in the audience today, and it looks like we have two online so far. So as folks join us, feel free to ask questions as we go. Specifically, as we go early on, we'll be talking a little bit in the weeds about some of the state statute and parking ordinances, just to get everybody on the same page. As I go through that, feel free to ask questions for clarification. I'm not a lawyer, but I'll do my best to try to explain exactly what these statutes and ordinances mean. And once we're all familiar, we'll jump on to some of the issues in a couple different areas and then talk about some solutions. So with that, I'll start sharing my screen. And just before I get into that, just so everybody knows who's here and available for questions, I'm Andrew McFadden. I'm the traffic engineer for the city of Fitchburg. I'm joined with Ned Hartwick.
I'm Lieutenant Hartwick with the Fitchburg Police Department, here to answer some questions and perspectives.
Yep, and thanks for joining me. So yeah, between the two of us, I think we should be able to answer most questions in terms of policy and on the enforcement side. So with that, I'll share my screen. All right. So like I mentioned, so first we'll start with state statute. It's kind of the overall Wisconsin standards that apply to Fitchburg, our city parking ordinances. Then we'll dive into winter parking regulation and some of the issues there. And then we'll talk about prohibited parking regulations and some of the issues there. All right, so there's a lot on this slide. I just want to put all state statutes on parking, well, most of them, on one slide so we didn't have to bounce around. What you'll see here are primarily two statutes, this 346.52, which is stopping prohibited in certain specified places. So you see a long list of different places where stopping is prohibited. So that's in an intersection, on a crosswalk, and the list kind of goes on from there. That certainly is, a long list of kind of short parking or stopping prohibitions. We also have 346.53, which is parking prohibitions in certain areas. And so you'll see a list there too. So loading zones, that's where the hydrant, the 10 feet from hydrant comes from, 4 feet from a alley or a driveway, and then 15 feet to the near side of a crosswalk. And so really between all those are kind of the statutory no parking. And so when we talk about yellow curb later on tonight, this is really where what that yellow curb is accentuating. So these are statutory no parking restrictions just specified in state statute. So, usually pretty small, but certainly there's a number of them along any given street between crosswalks, intersections, hydrants, and driveways. So. Any questions on the state statute? All right. So then I'll dive into the parking ordinances from the city. So I'll go through all of them, but I'll try to go pretty fast just so everybody's on the same page. So first off, 208, chapter 68-208. Vehicle abandonment prohibited. So this is our 48-hour rule. So vehicles parked longer than 48 hours can be towed and certainly can be ticketed. And then after 30 days of certified mail notice, the vehicle can be sold or disposed of. And Ned, I don't know if you want to jump in on kind of the regularity or frequency of this type of section being applied.
This is a pretty frequent ordinance that we handle, mainly when vehicles appear to be completely broken down and left for a significant period of time. We also run into it during the snowfall season in addition to alternate side parking, but it is something that we usually work with on a regular basis, and after a warning, it's typically remedied.
Awesome. Hey, Steve, I think you had a question?
Yeah. So the certified mail notice would go to the registered owner. What if a vehicle is not registered? Then it can't be parked even for a minute, right?
Our current ordinance right now doesn't speak to the needs for the vehicle to be registered. and that's one of the things that we're actually taking a look at. Not relevant to this conversation tonight with parking, but this would be more of a procedural. What happens typically when a vehicle is towed by a tow company, then they are the ones that take on the responsibility as far as it being abandoned. It's been cited by us, and then they're taking on that responsibility for contacting the owner. But to answer your question, yes, it does go to whoever the owner on the registration is at the time. So if someone had sold it and that had not been updated, then it would be to the person that last owned it.
And with respect to private property, that's private property of a third party, right?
Correct.
Someone who's objecting to having, for example, at a mall or something.
Correct. Someone who has control of that property and goes through
And
that
they don't
process.
want it there, it's not their car.
Correct.
Thank you, Ned.
And just to clarify, a few other neighboring jurisdictions do have that registered vehicle requirement, and so it's definitely something we're looking into as part of this process. All right, so next up, 209, so that's temporary parking regulations. So this is really establishing the provision for the police department to enact temporary parking regulations during cleaning, clearing, or repairing. So this would be those temporary signs you might see go up during a construction job that would say, no parking, and then we're required to post those in advance of the project so that folks have an opportunity to move their vehicle. There's also provision for experimental temporary regulations allowed up to 90 days, and those can be renewed for an additional 90 days. 210 is where the snow and ice emergency regulations are specified. And so really, and this might be a surprise to a few folks, but so the whole city right now is under, this is for emergency snow and ice. So this is a provision that the city can enact. It's a little bit out of order with our winter parking, alternate side parking. But this is in an event of a snow or ice emergency that the city calls. It would basically extend regular winter parking restrictions from 1 to 7, or usually from 1 to 7 will go from 7 to 7. So it gives the city a little bit more time to clear the snow. And then there is some flexibility defined as to which streets are odd parking and even parking. Really, that's, again, just a matter of allowing the city some flexibility in case there's areas that really need to be cleaned up. And that will be connected with our winter parking ordinance that I'll get to in a little bit. 210 would be parking on street limited to 24 hours. So when those signs are erected, that can be a type of parking. This 212 is the winter parking restriction that I noted. So this is really what's in effect now, knowing that it's in between November 15th and March 15th. And so during even days, you are only allowed to park on street on the even side of on the block from 1 to 7. And on odd days, the opposite. You're only allowed to park on the odd addressed side of the street on odd days from 1 to 7. So we'll be talking about that a little bit later, specifying with some examples, because I feel like it's always helpful. But today is the 31st, so today's an odd day. So this morning, folks should have been parked on the odd side of the street. So, yep.
Blurt it out, Steve.
Oh yeah, thanks, Steve.
Yeah, does this restriction apply to every street all winter long during the dates that you've indicated?
It does. Right now it is citywide. Yep.
Okay. Well, I mean, the only street that I'm concerned about is Leopold Way between Post and when it comes into the neighborhood where I live. There's never been alternate parking ever. I mean, really ever. And so I'm wondering if it's tell me about the enforcement. How do you enforce that?
So that's a great question, Steve, and I thought that went through. So we actually have that specific example later on. So if you want to wait on that, we can delve into this, because this is really, this is one of the key ones that we want to focus on. I'm just going through all of them right now, but Yeah, we can definitely
And
come
one
back to
more
that.
thing, Andrew.
Yep.
Madison has alternate side of the street parking rules as well, and they do not apply on Madison streets that only allow parking on one side. Do we have anything like that?
So there are a couple streets where there's been some confusion. We've definitely put up signs in those locations. I don't believe we have specific exceptions. I know some other cities do, mainly where there are those issues where one side of the street, there are businesses, and the other side of the street there isn't parking, or one-way streets, that sort of thing. So, but yeah, we can definitely get to that a little bit more in our second section, specifically focusing on winter parking restrictions. And I know, like, for example, East Sherrill was a great example where there was some confusion about which side to park on without addresses on the other. So we put up signs just to clarify that. So. But yeah, so we'll definitely dive into more of this in a little bit. So thanks for the questions. All right. School parking area restrictions. And so there are 3 specific streets where parking is restricted from 7 a.m. and from 2:30 to 3:30 a.m. when Verona schools are in session. And those are specified there. There's also parking restricted during certain periods in specific areas. And so there's 9 streets that have that specific restriction. And we have that in a map that we can talk about in a little bit.
Were you going to talk about school parking in more detail?
We can certainly talk about it in more detail with a map. I can show parking regulation areas if you're interested.
So if you're not going to be covering it as part of the sticky policies we're going to deal with in a later section, I'll ask my question now.
Okay.
So I routinely drive on Norwich Street and bike on Norwich Street, and I'm very aware of the restrictions there. It surprised me that the restrictions are set up so that the kids, it's to remove parked cars so the kids do not have to walk around the parked cars when they are walking to school in these areas with no sidewalks. And the weird thing about that is that generally kids are taught, we're all taught as kids, to when there's no sidewalks and you have to walk on the shoulder of the road, to walk facing traffic. But in this case, the restrictions clear the parked cars away from the side that is on the way to school in the morning and on the way from school in the afternoon. So it seems like they should be reversed on the sides of the street. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so I think you're talking about, Richardson, Tudor, Osmondson, this area.
I'm talking about Norwich.
Yeah,
right
sorry,
there.
Norwich. Yep. And so it's the same, can be applied to Richardson. And so, yes, I believe that that's the case, that these, basically this combination of no parking was specified so that the street was clear for kids to walk to school. I will note that it is, certainly separated from the school area and not contiguous to the school area. So another interesting kind of vestige of this policy. So I don't know all the details of this, but this is definitely a particular location. There's also a good bit of overlap here, as far as I can tell, from both the AM, the PM, and the AM and PM regulations, as well as it's included in the school ordinances, as well as the special case specific times a day ordinances. So I think there's a good amount of cleaning up to do here, and I think that's a good point to potentially flip-flop those if we still want them. So, yep, great point. And if there's other thoughts on parking before we move on, I'm happy to talk about that, or on school parking specifically.
Yeah, I think that's an open issue that you should go back to if you're not planning on dealing it with today.
Sure. And just to note, one thing we did do in preparation for this meeting was to put all parking ordinance regulations as far as prohibited parking and prohibited during certain times of day within one GIS map, just so we have kind of the record of that and we can talk through that. And so this we can definitely put on the city website. This is just the kind of codifying the city ordinances into a map-based format. And so this, what you'll see here is in red are parking prohibitions, full all day, every day. And then some of the other colors, you'll have some of those school zone, specific times of day, and I can certainly provide the legend to clarify that. So we have, in here, this is specific to the Verona school days. So orange is the afternoon, this brown is the morning, and the red is both. And so you can see that there is some overlap on the south side of the street there. And similarly, over here on Richardson, it's very similar. There's also some overlap there. So certainly some cleanup to do there. We also have, just as we're talking about school, we also have one Madison School parking restriction. So up here we have Madison from 7 to 4:30 is in this area, and then from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. and from 2:30 to 3:30 this area. We also have a little bit. So yeah, all on the south side of the street, and again, there's some overlap there as well. So. All right. Any other questions on school parking? All right. So yeah, and so like I mentioned, there are also just kind of some specific times of day. So I'll jump on that real fast. And so that's mainly this area in pink, which has pink and the area on East Sherrill associated with the farmers market. So this will be this area. So this will be Thursdays 2 to 7. As well as some of these pink areas. I know specifically there's this one up on King James, 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., 2:30 to 6:30. I'm not entirely sure the origin of this closure. It might be school related or bus stop related.
School bus stops.
School bus stop, yep. So, yep, those are primarily kind of those special case prohibitions, and the rest are primarily, by and large, we have 34 red, full prohibitions. That's certainly the most common. All right. Okay, moving on. So we do also have a handicap loading zone. These are ADA loading zone spaces. So we do have provision to Board of Public Works can authorize these permits when recommended by city staff. And so these would be areas where we would erect signs for ADA loading zones. And I'm not aware of any, but there certainly could be some, on the city streets. So with signs, right?
There might be one on Cahill, Maine, on the east side in Hatchery Hill.
Okay.
Next to that, children's therapy. I forget the name of the business, but it's near the entrance to the J building.
Gotcha. Okay. Good to know. And so that we can definitely try to add that to this map just to clarify all our regulations. All right. And then we also have large vehicle parking restricted. So there is, I believe, a typo in this ordinance. I have what I believe it should be saying, but primarily no large vehicle parking between 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., so at night, and then no large vehicle parking for more than 2 hours during the day between 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I do believe these dates or these times were repeated. So we have some cleanup to do there, but that's really the intention of this is to restrict any large vehicle parking on the street overnight and allowing some up to 2 hours during the day. Any questions there?
How are they defined?
Large vehicles, I believe it's 10,000 pounds. I can double check on that. I just kind of have the cliff notes in here.
Would it include a tractor, a semi-trailer tractor without the trailer?
Large vehicle is defined here as any automobile, truck, trailer, truck, power unit, bus, recreational vehicle, or combination of vehicles, and then it specifies a gross vehicle weight in excess of 8,000 pounds and exceeding 16 feet in length or exceeding 8 feet in height measured from the roadway to the highest point of the vehicle.
Thanks. Thanks, Dad. Thanks for backing me up there. Awesome. Any other questions on large vehicle parking? Okay. Motorhomes, mobile homes, and certain trailer parking restricted. So this might be also getting to that point. So no parking of these vehicles longer than 24 hours, and the Board of Public Works can issue permits for vehicles for certain events that's deemed necessary. So, all right. Then we also have several prohibited parking areas, so I can kind of walk through this. So 231 specifies those 34 that you saw in red on that map. These are locations where parking is prohibited all times a day throughout the year. We also have ordinances restricting parking on street for the sale of vehicles. On traffic calming devices, that does exclude speed humps, but the other sorts of traffic calming devices, whether that be traffic circles, bulb outs, that sort of thing. Fire hydrants, so this is a reiteration of the state statute, no parking within 10 feet of a fire hydrant. And then also bus stops, so no non-bus parking in bus stops. And loading is okay as long as it doesn't interfere with bus operations. And so that's a general note that we don't have the specific bus stops. Some cities do that, but we just define it generally as bus stops. So that's. Oh, do we have a question?
Yes,
Steve?
we do. When I was reviewing, these laws all apply to streets where Fitchburg has jurisdiction. For example, there's no parking on the Verona Road, but we don't say that. The DOT does, or the county. When I was reviewing the speed limits around the city for one of our bike applications, I discovered that there were areas in the ordinances where jurisdiction of a road, and I can't remember whether it was Fish Hatchery north of McKee or McKee from Fish Hatchery to wherever our jurisdiction ends, Fitch-Verona or wherever, had the jurisdiction had gone from city, would have been McKee Road, had it gone from county to city, but we had not added in to our ordinances speed regulations. And so they were unregulated by the county and unregulated by the city, and therefore assumed the defaults, which would be 25 miles per hour for McKee Road. And we all know McKee Road is 40 miles an hour, and it's signed that way. I just wanted to throw out that you might want to review parking regulations. So for example, Fish Hatchery Road north of McKee is now our jurisdiction, not county. And we don't allow parking on it, but I don't think you had it in red on your map, and it's probably not in the ordinances. So I would suggest that's an area for a full forensic audit and possible cleanup.
Thanks, Steve. That's a good point. Yep. Always, it's always it's great to make these things, but maintaining them is definitely another story. And I think that's an important thing to note about all of this is that we need to make sure that we're constantly updating that as things change. I do just want to clarify, North Fish Hatchery Road is still a county road. We have taken over snow maintenance on it from McKee north, but just
okay. Well, but the point remains.
Yep. Awesome. Okay, so that's really all of our parking ordinances in a nutshell. Tonight, although there's lots of interplay between these, we're going to be focused on these main three, so snow and ice emergency regulations, the winter parking restrictions, and prohibited parking. Certainly open to talking about other ones. And I do just want to note that, these are really our on-street, where the city has an amenity that we're trying to make sure we're regulating. There's similarly a good amount of discussion for development, parking, parking standards, those sorts of things that developments, have to adhere to. We're not talking about any of that tonight. That's a great other conversation, but just to maintain focus, we're going to be talking about on-street parking tonight. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate these that we saw earlier, so there's kind of these two main ordinances, the snow and ice emergency regulations, which we very rarely, at least in years past, in recent history, have enacted. And so this would just extend the all day, every day from November 15th to March 15th, alternate side parking regulations, and extend that from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. to 7 to 7. So extending that a little bit longer, giving us some more time to clear the streets, and does allow some flexibility for defining when, what night, which sides of the streets get winter parking operations. So the other one is that all day, every day, and so I can go into some examples. And so really, just taking an example just south of here, so we're up here right now, just south of here on Research Park Drive. The address is here, so this is the odd for the last digit. And so, parking here on odd days like today, this morning, this would have been the correct place to park. And then tonight, as you're going to bed, parking your vehicle on the street, for tomorrow morning, this would be the correct place to park. So just to kind of clarify that, I'll go through another example.
We have 2 odd days in a row.
Oh, right,
From
sorry.
the 31st to the 1st.
Yep, sorry. That's what I used
days,
yesterday.
right.
I'm sorry. Yep. So yesterday, it would have been good to park there. So, sorry. I should read my slides better. The question does come up of what might happen if we have more than 50% occupancy. And so there's a few places around the city. I think Steve Streck, you noted this one earlier. So Leopold Way might be one of those. There are, you can see in this area, there's a lot of places to park, both on and off street. Not all the time. They're depending upon the time of the year and how many spaces are available, there might be ebbs and flows in kind of the parking occupancy for, parking demand versus the parking availability. And in those cases, we do see that, parking continues despite the winter's, alternate side parking regulations. So the question occurs of, this is a good example of what happens when parking exceeds 50%. There's not enough parking if you have to alternate every night.
Wait a minute, excuse me, exceeds 60% of what? What are you talking? I'm not sure what you mean.
Sure. So I said 50%. So parking occupancy is defined as, so you basically divide up a street into 20-foot sections and say, here's how many parked vehicles can fit on this section.
Right.
And so, when I say 50%, I mean when there's enough vehicles parked on a given street that they wouldn't be able to fit on just one side or the other. So that over the 50%, that's bumping over that threshold to get to the point of, if this was only 50% parked, then we could certainly imagine that folks could move their cars over to the other side of the street every night, and they would do so without problems. Once we get past that 50% threshold, we do start running into issues. The question is...
No, wait a sec. The issues are that these people don't park in their parking lots. The parking lots are virtually empty, okay? They park on the street because it's closer to their door. But there are parking lots for these apartment houses that are 30% full, maybe?
Sure. So I think...
So,
Yep.
So I'm not sure what you mean.
Yep, so that's a good point. And so we don't have, I think that could be true, certainly anecdotally. I've definitely driven this area sometimes, a few times, and done some kind of anecdotal observations. And the parking in the lot isn't at 100%. You're correct. At 30% seems low to me based on my observations. But there certainly is a question of, are there other places to park? If we enforced more, if we gave more warnings,
Of course there are.
if we had places or signs up, would we see, better utilization of the street, easier clearing? That's definitely a question. And I think in this particular example, that could be true. In other examples, like potentially newer developments, No Oaks Ridge comes to mind, that, this same question comes up. Do we have enough parking on street that we exceed that 50%? There's not another place for folks to park. By intention, I think a lot of these places were built, to utilize on-street parking to make these areas more dynamic and, cost effective. The question is, where do folks park? And so I think there's a few areas of the city where we're starting to see these types of issues. And so I've kind of highlighted those areas in yellow. We just talked about Leopold and No Oaks Ridge, these two. There are several on this map, from Chalet Gardens to Coho, Anton on the west side, King James Way to Research Park. So I think there's a lot of different examples that, maybe might, if one or two could be solved by just a simple fix, maybe there's other ones that might be more complicated. So that's why we want to bring it up to talk about some options, kind of holistically, of what we could do in the city that would solve kind of the issue more globally. So, other questions about this? And I can bring this up and zoom into areas if folks have questions, or if folks know of other areas that aren't on this list. And Chris, if you want
To distill it down, we are talking about the intersection of winter parking.
Steve, can you
Regulations and high overnight residential parking.
Sorry, Steve, can you repeat that? Sorry.
The problem statement is the intersection, or the problem space is the intersection between high overnight residential parking and winter parking regulations that take away half of it each night. Is that a good summary?
That's a good summary. I would say that right now, that latter half is true everywhere in the city, right? So in this particular case, it's only places where we have high overnight residential parking utilization where we're seeing issues, knowing that the regulations currently are in effect citywide.
Right. And generally we can say that because single family or even duplex, one place that you might add is the end of Richardson where the duplexes are just south of Lacey. But we often don't get densities in the single family neighborhoods that can generate that kind of parking demand. So these are generally in multifamily neighborhoods. Would you agree with that?
Yep, I would definitely say, certainly it's possible that as the city develops, we have more mixed-use developments, there would be places where we would see these issues develop in more retail areas. That would still be on street, but currently it's primarily residential.
If you look at Kinsale Place across the street, across Lacey Road from the library, the commercial component is not causing the problem. It's the residential component that would lead to overnight parking issues. So whereas mixed use can give you the same effects as multifamily, to be clear, it's the residential component of that mixed use that is causing these issues, right?
So I would say that our current parking regulations state that these, I'll just go back to this, that these are only in effect from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. And so, what we typically see is that residential parking is highest during that time when folks are at home versus likely lowest during in mixed use retail establishments. So I think just the nature of our current ordinance and that time frame kind of elicits residential parking to be the issue areas currently. I don't think that has to be the case. I think historically we have been we start at night. Typically, that's when we want to clear the roads before the AM rush hour. So we start maybe at 3:30 to clear the roads, and so that was and that's consistent with a number of jurisdictions around here. I think in practice, a lot of times we don't get to the residential streets until later or potentially the next day. So that's certainly something we could change. That basically we wouldn't have our regulations effective during this high peak of residential parking. So that's definitely one of the solutions we're looking at. But yeah, I would say right now, with the timeframes they are, we typically have residential issues. And did you want to say something?
Yeah, Chris Armstrong here, representing Avante Properties, and our development in Uptown, I think, is one of the areas where we have some of this density. And just to kind of frame it for us, we're trying to estimate a number of parking stalls needed per unit or per bed, or however we're calculating that. And our equation would like to count those street parking stalls, but if we're in this winter alternate street parking from the middle of November to March, and we can only really count half of them, because that's a pretty long stretch. If we were in a snow emergency situation where we declared a snow emergency we would count those stalls. And so the effect for us is to, if we stick with this alternate street parking, we need to find those stalls somewhere, and we're going to increase our parking lots. And I don't think any of us want to see, larger surface parking lots when the city's built the infrastructure to store those cars. If you go out to our project, at this time of night, our service stalls are pretty jammed right now, and our tenants are getting tickets for not moving off of those streets on a pretty regular basis. So our hope is that there's some thought put into some of these dense areas, implementing a snow emergency situation like Madison uses, and maybe even piggybacking on their notification system, or I'm sure that there's a way for people to sign up, and we can notify our tenants. But as we develop and try to maximize that city infrastructure, I think everyone would like to see us put it into the buildings and the land area into the buildings and not into surface parking. So. That's our motivation with the snow situation.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay. So I did have a few more slides on this just to kind of reiterate maybe the effect. And so I think these were hopefully indicative of some of the areas that we see these issues. I think Chris, you might be talking about this one in particular, Noakes Ridge. I think it's one example. I think in terms of the effect, and I can certainly have Lieutenant Hartwick talk a little bit more about this. I think really the intention here is if we don't move them, I think, just kind of talking about potential ramifications, there certainly could be some snow effects, folks getting trapped in, these are from last year, but, I think if we have low compliance in some of these areas, and especially if we have multiple kind of repeated snow events that can, maybe there's not one specific one that would warrant a snow emergency, but over time, this can certainly result in some dangerous conditions, both from an emergency vehicles perspective of the road getting narrower, becoming impassable, but also, in terms of making those parking stalls virtually ineffective, right? If folks can't park in there, they can't get out. People have to push them out. So I think there's no really simple solutions, especially if folks are kind of inconsistently doing something, right? If there's just one person parked there, we can't effectively clear the snow. So I think that's really why we want to talk about this generally, so that we can make sure we're still keeping that balance between keeping on-street parking available, but also having clear roads. Steve Strack, did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, the picture you're showing right now, I believe, is Leopold Way, but I might be wrong.
That's correct.
If it's not Leopold Way, it looks just like Leopold Way looks right now. And so, first of all, I've got two questions. The first one is I missed the first 2 minutes of this presentation. Am I talking to Andrew McFadden? Is that
That's
you,
correct.
Andrew?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Good. The second question is, are you going to enforce the Fitchburg parking regulations on Leopold Way?
Thanks, Steve. That's a great question. That leads us to a great segue to the next solution, or sorry, what do neighboring cities do, and then solutions after that.
No. I'd like to know if you're going to enforce that. I don't care what anybody else is doing.
Sure. I mean, that's a great point, Steve. So I'll say that's one of the solutions that we'll be talking about today, among others. And so I'll talk a little bit about what other cities do, and then we can talk about that. Does that sound good?
All right, whatever. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. So what's just for consistency, it's good to know kind of what other cities do, knowing especially particularly that Madison, a boundary city that a lot of folks might not even know if they're in Fitchburg or Madison as kind of the northern boundary ebbs and flows. So we want to make sure that consistency is important, and though it's not the only thing that we think about, it's definitely a key factor. So Madison does designate winter alternate side parking for all streets. And then they do have, as folks mentioned, this snow emergency zone. So basically in the center of downtown, that's kind of expanded a little bit over the years. Those streets are exempt from the winter alternate side parking regulations unless it's a snow emergency. And they do have pretty good tools for kind of getting that out there, both notifications as well as some online stuff that you can check out on the website and put in your address and it'll let you know where to park. So they do a really great job of kind of specifying that, but I just want to mention that all areas of Madison that are adjacent to Fitchburg are still in that alternate side parking restriction. So that snow emergency zone didn't quite stretch all the way down here, so though it does exist, it's not necessarily in force along our boundary. So Middleton does have alternate side parking restrictions with some exceptions on specific streets. That's what I mentioned before, of mainly streets where a lake or other beach features on the other side of the street. Stoughton designates alternate side parking only during snow emergencies. Sun Prairie prohibits parking on snow routes, and then it does prohibit parking on all public roads during a snow emergency, much like Janesville will prohibit all parking during snow emergencies. But Janesville does specify some municipal lots where folks can park downtown. And then Verona has winter alternate side parking with some no parking restrictions on specific streets again. So that's kind of what some area cities do. So there's a good range. I will also mention, folks, there's places where parking is restricted during all winter months, November 15th and March 15th on all streets for the whole winter. There's kind of that extreme. There's certainly, places like Minneapolis do a 3-day rule where they do the main snow emergency routes, then they do alternate side parking. So there are variations for sure, but I thought this was a good mix of kind of what folks do around this area. And so this is kind of the 3 possible solutions we've kind of been brainstorming. So I would think some sort of mix, or maybe potentially 4th or 5th option could be helpful. So I think Steve Streck, I think what you were perhaps indicating was increasing the notifications, the signage, the warnings, the ticketing. I think that's certainly one option. This option 2. And then potentially along with that, establishing a notification system similar to Madison that would send those notifications out, give folks really the best chance they have to remember to move their vehicles so they don't get a warning or a ticket. And then, certainly signage is another part of that. It is increasing the city's cost and operation budget to put up signs. But in areas where we really need it, it's definitely an option. So you could put up signs like what we did on East Sherrill, just to clarify where the no parking exists, and what alternate side parking is where. So we could certainly do that along with that in some of these areas that really we're seeing issues over time. Another option, similar to what folks mentioned, is potentially establishing snow emergency zones similar to downtown Madison. And these would be in particular areas where we talked about, those yellow areas where we see high parking utilization. That would certainly, potentially limit the city's snow clearing ability in those zones when it's not a snow emergency. But there is certainly provisions we could add that if any street becomes unpassable, the city would certainly put up no parking notifications and then be able to plow those streets during that time. So there's certainly some provision if that does happen. So that would kind of give us a little bit of a backstop in case we have issues. And then this third option is to shift alternate side parking hours to midday. And so this is talking a little bit more specifically about what we're talking about, this residential parking issue. So this could potentially solve that to some extent by shifting the time period from 1 a.m. to 7 a.m. to midday, 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. And so this would overlap with operations normal hours and be more consistent with how we're currently plowing residential streets the second day or later in the day after we've plowed the main routes. And so, certainly all storms are different. And so depending upon when it comes and how much snow there is and how wet it is, that might vary. But this would certainly basically be putting our snow clearing operations smack dab in the middle of when we have our lowest residential parking demand. So certainly that shift might help, but I don't think that would fix it in isolation. So potentially coupled with another solution. So those are kind of the three options we were thinking about. Are there thoughts, comments, additions that folks would like to mention? Chris?
Yeah, I just, we were talking about this today at the office, and some of our employees that live downtown Madison said that during their snow emergency declaration, that they come in and tow vehicles and just clear the street out, at owner's expense. And then I was also wondering if, tickets would be, in Madison are at a higher price than they are, just for alternate side parking. Is there a different violation, a more expensive violation to kind of create that, urgency and incentive for the declaration of a snow emergency? But, towing in the cars, I thought was like, well, that gets everything off of there. I don't know how much of a effort or expense that is to the city if you're assessing it back to the car owner eventually. So.
I think our alternate side, when there is no snow emergency, is consistent with the city of Madison at $20. And I believe that theirs goes up when there is a snow emergency. The towing, obviously the city of Madison has the luxury of having parking enforcement, full-time parking enforcement, that they're able to manage those processes quite a bit easier, and that's what they're able to focus on. With us, the enforcement comes down to police officers that are working. We do have 2 civilian employees who assist in the beginning of the season. They switch their work hours to come in and help provide warnings in advance of the alternate side parking season. But again, going back to the point that we just don't have the personnel to manage a large-scale towing operation. And then when there is a snow emergency, those tow trucks are typically downtown Madison towing those vehicles. So it would have to be something that I would imagine contracts and work would have to be done with the tow company to facilitate that. And from my perspective, realistically, there are very few fine amounts that are going to motivate people in those instances. I do think there is some value to towing vehicles, but again, what impact does that have both on residents and on our city operations in general?
Thanks, Dan. Steve Streck, I think you had your hand up, and then Steve Arnold.
I'm sorry, was that a police officer who was just talking?
Yep. Lieutenant Hartwick is here.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
It's Lieutenant Hartwick, Ned Hartwick.
Thank you. Are you saying that no matter what we do, we can't enforce the laws that we have now?
No, quite the opposite. I'm saying that we enforce the laws and we do write alternate side parking citations. However, even in areas that are heavily ticketed, we aren't towing these vehicles. And so the citations we've had, I recall working night shift when I was still on patrol and writing numerous alternate side parking citations to the same vehicles, and it was just moving from one side of the street to the other. Each night they would seem to get the date wrong and park, so cars would end up with 10 citations for the parking season. So I don't necessarily know that issuing citations is going to gain long-term compliance in these situations. We often have to look at the environment that we're setting up, what kind of signage, what kind of messaging are we sending out to get compliance versus just issuing citations.
Well, what do you suggest we do for a place that, I mean, you saw some of these pictures. We've got one road that there's so many cars parked on the sides of the road that the plows have to go around them, obviously. And pretty soon, there's not enough room for two cars to go, both ways on the road. And that's what we have now on, for example, Leopold Way. That's what we have. So what do you suggest we do to fix that?
Well, I think that's one of the things that we're here to talk about tonight in conjunction with Public Works, who ultimately is responsible for the snow clearing operations, and finding the balance as to what's going to facilitate that in the most efficient manner when those operations are underway, and the timing of those things in balancing with development and the variety of factors that we have with population density here in 35 square miles that continues to grow and develop. So there are a lot of considerations that have to, I think, fall into place to address, especially the few stretches of roads that continually have, and not only during the snowfall season, but Leopold Way, for example, even during the summer months, getting a large fire truck through there is sometimes tricky based on how people park and how dense that is parked.
Well, that's probably right, but I mean, obviously, to me, the easiest way to do it is to if you enforce the regulations, one side of the street would be empty for a night, and the plow could come through and plow all of that stuff onto the curb, and that would be clear. And the next day, people could park there, but that's not happening now.
Well, I understand the perspective. I think the one thing that we run up against in some of these areas is we have a number of folks that work different hours throughout the day. The several apartment complexes have severely limited. They only issue parking permits for the number of units that are allocated each apartment. And so you have a number of guests, you have temporary people that are folks that are living with these residents there. So there are a whole host of factors that go into how many cars are parked overnight, especially. And so I think it's not just as simple as issuing citations and gaining compliance and then that's being sustained for the snowfall season. One of the other things that we find is typically we'll issue a large slew of tickets after a snowfall event. Due to the weather and the inconsistencies with snowfall, we'll go through a period where there's no significant snowfall, and by that time we've lost a great deal of traction as it relates to people understanding the ordinances. And we also have a really high turnover rate in some areas where we're constantly moving in new residents that are trying to figure out where to park and what their habits and patterns are.
Well, all right. Well, I mean, there's room for them to park in the parking lots that are provided by the apartment owners. I'll ask a third time. What can be done to fix this? So far you haven't said anything can be done to fix it.
I think we're looking at three possible solutions right here of addressing the situation. And I would point out again that not all of the folks that live in these apartments have a parking space due to lease regulations. So typically the apartment complex will issue 1 to 2 parking stalls in the lot. However, there may be more than that living in the apartment, and so there may not be places for folks to park. And then we also aren't going to regulate, and as we indicated, there's not a ton of additional parking for visitors that are in the area are staying over at an apartment. So I think the three solutions that we have indicated up here would all go to address some of this.
And Steve, I'd like to move on to Steve Arnold, and then I know we have a question here in the audience. Steve Arnold, did you have a question? I know you raised your hand earlier.
So I recall, so first of all, ice and snow control policies are very different between Madison, which I think is most relevant, and Fitchburg. Madison plows salt routes continuously, or salts them, plows them if snow is coming down hard, continuously throughout the snowfall. Then at the end of the snowfall, if there's more than 3 inches on residential streets, they call in their 150 contractors and they do the whole city. And they generally declare snow emergency on the isthmus for 2 nights to get things plowed out. Fitchburg has, last I knew, 11 plow trucks and drivers for them. And the city is divided up into 11 plow zones, plow routes. Now, putting aside North Fish Hatchery and McKee, where we plow continuously during the snowstorm, when the snow stops, Fitchburg plows everything, even if we've only had a ½ inch of snow. I don't know exactly what the lower boundary is. And residents constantly compliment the city of Fitchburg for keeping the residential streets clear. So if the city is doing a citywide plowing from the time the snow stops till it's done, how many hours does it take our plow trucks to do that? Can they do it in a shift, or does it take more than a shift?
Sure. And that's a great question. Certainly, it depends upon the snow event, right? If that is continuous, right? But I can definitely get a little bit more. I wish I had Mark here. Oh, okay.
The snow is stopped, and that they're now undertaking the citywide plowing. Can they get it done in 8 hours, or does it take 10 or 12?
I'm not sure. I believe that they're working 12-hour shifts, and so I imagine 12. I think in this particular case, when we're talking about the third option of shifting that, that would be in a case of they would be primarily focused on the major streets, plowing residential streets as needed, in the 11 zone system, and then following up the next day with alternate site parking to clear it to the curb, right? So the multiple passes, right? Getting eventually getting to the curb cleared, if that makes sense. But I can follow up. I mean, that's a specific example. Again, it would depend upon the snow event and what the snow's like and what the conditions. If it goes from 32 degrees down to freezing, like we saw earlier this year, I think that's certainly a consideration, and how we're applying salt and brine as well. So I don't want to say there's ever a solid answer, an easy one, but I can definitely ask Mark to follow up on that.
So, so I don't think that we should abandon our policies of having enough resources to do the entire city. I understand that we're going to plow on a heavily parked street. We're going to plow 2 stripes down the center, and then we're going to come back when the cars are gone. Again, this is theoretical, for alternate street, alternate sides over the next 2 nights and clear to the curb. And then they get out and they clear the bus stops and the median islands and things like that. I think that the city should continue that policy, and that the council should ratify that, make sure we have the resources to do that. I don't think switching to the middle of the day is going to do it, because it's going to draw it out a lot more, and we're going to lose that competitive edge that we have of having better ice and snow control than Madison. I would like to see a snow emergency zone in the smart code areas. And as I told you by email earlier, there are some other areas that would need that, such as potentially Cahill, Maine, by the Agora on East Sherrill, areas where there is a heavy street parking demand. Now, I think that areas that have urban development in the urban form, in addition to the smart code areas, should be able to apply to be in the snow emergency zone or to be a snow emergency zone. I don't think that areas that are built in the suburban form, like Leopold Way, should do that. If they want to come through and knock down a bunch of buildings and build another High Line, now they're urban, okay? So Traceway by the High Line is urban. There's plenty of land, and it could be that they're not plowing their lots well enough, but I think that the Leopold Way situation really needs notifications, maybe more signage. If people are not getting it, then maybe we have to help them get it, like you did with the gardens on East Sherrill Parkway. But urban areas should be able to apply for this, and I don't think it should be so hard to implement, because I think we should just piggyback on the Madison notification system. It would be very easy to get all the news anchors to say there's a snow emergency in Madison and Fitchburg. Every time they say Madison, they say and Fitchburg. People can go to the City of Madison homepage and see the green or red, whether there's a snow emergency, right on the homepage all winter long. I am signed up for the City of Madison snow emergency. Anybody can do that. So I get notified every time there's a snow emergency, every time it's extended. Fitchburg residents could do that too. It would solve Chris Armstrong's problem. There are no parking areas by the railroad tracks and so on. They would not be affected. So I would like to see number 2 here, increased notification signage warnings on the suburban areas where you're not getting good compliance, like Leopold Way. And I would like to see the snow emergency zones established in city ordinance and piggyback on the Madison system operationally.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate that. Chris?
Well, yeah, I can't disagree with anything Steve said there. So I thought he summarized it pretty well. From my perspective, I thought I had thought about this a lot, but I think he might have thought about it even a little bit more. So I thought that was a good summary. I think that just from a developer perspective, one thing that you can encourage with anybody who owns an apartment project or is developing one is to not have designated parking stalls on their surface parking lot. I think that creates for a lot of vacant surface stalls on a surface parking lot, and that can be just a recommendation that could help utilize some of those situations that Steve Streck is noticing. So. But I think 1 and 2, I think are things that would immensely improve our situation. Thanks.
Okay. Are there any other comments on alternate side parking before we move on?
I'll throw out one more. Andrew, you and I talked about parking policy in other areas, and I talked about the importance of employee parking cash out for people who did not drive to work, and residential parking debundling for people who rent in multifamily who do not need their parking places or potentially need more than 2 spaces per unit. Maybe they have a boat or something. That is an area where the zoning code could mandate parking cash out for employees and parking, residential parking debundling for multifamily. So you would not have designated spaces under buildings, or you might have them. Well, designated spaces are not too bad for residential because the cars usually come home every night. But you know, if somebody needs no spaces or one space instead of two spaces per apartment, they should definitely have that option. And part of that is debundling the rent of the parking space from the apartment or condo. And another part of it is not designating parking spaces as reserved for individual tenants, like Chris brought up.
Yep, there's definitely a good point about those kind of play off of each other, but I know trying to stick to just on street tonight, but yes, definitely good points for a later conversation.
Well, the Leopold Way situation leaks into the off-street parking, and that's why we have to keep going back to it.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, well, moving on. So the other major section we want to talk about tonight was the current parking prohibitions. So these are a number of different areas, 34 specific areas for all day, everyday parking prohibition, as well as several other areas for temporary or school days, as we mentioned. Some are very short as 30 feet. Others are overlapping, and some are designated by signs that over the years haven't been updated in ordinance or vice versa. So we have some inconsistencies out there, and we can talk about a few of them. And so this is the map that I showed earlier. And so these are some of the issue areas. So one question I get often is, what does this yellow curb mean? Is that a no parking area? And in some cases, yes, definitely. Some cases we've used it appropriately to just to further designate what's in ordinance and what's on official traffic signs. I believe Madison has it written in the ordinance that it's actually that the yellow paint is kind of an extension, and that where it's yellow you cannot park there. It's as good as a traffic sign. We don't have that, so it's really just supplemental to the traffic signs in the ordinance currently. So in this particular case, you see a parking sign there that says no parking one way. You see it yellow, and this was done well because we have the parking lines in there as well, indicating where folks should park. So that's all kind of clarified. I would say that this parking sign should have moved to the end if that's indeed where that yellow is and where the parking stalls start. So really, that's a sign move, if anything. So, but so a lot of times we will we'll be using this to designate those statutory no parking areas. So that's 4 feet from a driveway, 15 feet from a crosswalk, in the intersection, areas where perhaps just the supplemental striping will just help clarify what's already in statute. We don't like to put, there are places on East Sherrill Parkway where we have large areas with yellow paint. We're trying to move away from that now simply because it's hard to maintain that, number one, and if areas change, it's hard to remove that yellow paint. So really we want to try to keep this to a minimum where we know places won't change, and those are places that are statutory or where we really know we're going to leave that no parking. So that's hopefully helps clarify that. Any questions about yellow curb?
See, there's a hydrant there too.
Oh, there you go. That's what it is. Yep, the no parking sign there, and then the 10-foot from hydrant. Yep, we could have moved this sign over here just to clarify things, but I think this one worked out.
The city forester would be on your case if you tried to move that sign over there.
Gotcha. That might have been it. And there's always a story there.
There.
Another area where we've seen recent parking issues is Oregon Road north of Rimrock, and so I'll just go to this. And so this area, just to kind of back up, is this area on the north boundary of Fitchburg. And so the town of Madison currently signs this as no parking, and we have on-street bike lanes there on Oregon Road up to Ski Lane. But unfortunately, when we did that change, I'm just going back to the street view, hopefully. Maybe not. When we made that change, we did not update the street signage or the ordinance. And so this is an area where over time, I think initially with construction vehicles for the apartments, and now with folks living in apartments, we're starting to see an increase in on-street parking there. And to folks' credit, there are no signs up, there is no ordinance, and so one could imagine that you could park there. And so this is a case where just clarifying ordinance posting signs, no parking anytime with an arrow in both directions would likely be the correct way to go. Unfortunately, we just didn't get out there fast enough to prevent people from parking in the first place. And then now what's happening during the snow is we're having, lessened operations or snow clearing operations. So definitely something we want to clean up. And so that's, an issue that came up within last year that we're certainly looking to clean up this spring. Another one was Sub-Zero Parkway. So this is a little bit, so we saw the yellow curb down the street. Now this is further east. I'll just go to it in Street View. And so this is a relatively new road in Fitchburg. When it was installed, I believe the ordinance was, just to mention, going back to our parking areas, if we turn on just the parking regulations, we can see that parking was prohibited on the south side of the entire stretch of Sub-Zero Parkway. So what should be the entire stretch turned out to be not quite the entire stretch. So there were some areas, specifically, in front of race day events and Hop House, where we did allow parking, contrary to what the ordinance says. Also, we have a bike lane on the north side where we have no parking bike lanes. Unfortunately, we're seeing some uptick in parking in that bike lane. Similarly, on the south side, parking in the bike lane on the south side. And so with the increased parking demand of some of the area businesses, Hop House, race day events, we'd like to update this, certainly, kind of clarify what the ordinance says, and then potentially add some on-street parking there while still maintaining the bike lanes. And so we'll be clarifying that through new striping, but also an update to the signage out there and kind of the parking ordinance. And so again, this is just an example of maybe a new project comes along, the project and the ordinance don't quite match up. And in doing so, we create a situation where officers have a tough time enforcing because they don't have the ordinance to back them up. And Ned, I don't know if you had any comments about this particular one, just from past operations.
Yes.
No, this was brought to our attention with high volumes of folks heading out to the Hop House, and then also folks that are using the trail there. And just due to the signage and the ordinance not matching up with the signage, it was a difficult situation for us to be out there consistently enforcing or really enforcing with anything other than warnings and trying to work a little bit with Public Works on some signage and the businesses along there as well. Thanks.
Question, Steve?
Yeah. So first, I want to clarify that these are bike lanes because there's a curb. People should never park in bike lanes. There either should be no bike lanes. You could have a wide lane if you want to allow parking and not a stripe. But if there is, if it's designated as a bike lane, there should not be parking in it. I'm going to contrast that to paved shoulders, like further south on Seminole Highway, along Wayland Road in the newest done stretches. A paved shoulder is a multi-use area. It serves both as a bike lane and as a bikeway, but also as a breakdown lane. And so you can have emergency parking or even non-emergency parking on a paved shoulder. These are mostly in the rural areas, but we sometimes have curb and gutter depending on the slope in those areas. Back in 2005, we were discussing a request by Pancake Cafe for more parking. And at that time, our ordinances did not allow parking in a bike lane. And so as a way of providing more parking there, when Nesbitt Road was chip sealed, the bike lanes that had been painted there before 2006 or so were not restored. And that turned out to be a mistake, I believe, because people speed on Nesbitt Road in motor vehicles, and that parking, on-street parking is never used. But around that time, the ordinance was changed so that a bike lane was not regulatory for prohibiting parking. I think we should go back to that. Now along Lacey Road in the newest section, we have no parking bike lane signs instead of merely bike lane signs. On Fish Hatchery Road, where the county, South Fish Hatchery Road, where the county does not allow parking, we have ordinary bike lane signs that do not say no parking. Nevertheless, the ordinance does not allow parking on South Fish Hatchery Road. I believe that we should go back to the situation where if you have bike lanes and parking, such as on the other side of Sub-Zero Parkway here, then you can have a bike lane sign. If you do not allow parking, there should be bike lane, no parking signs like on Lacey Road. And while we're talking about this, I know it's cheaper to apply the 4-inch stripe to indicate a parking lane, but I believe that this is most clear in front of Kinsale Place. We should be using L's and T's instead of stripes to indicate parking, because what will happen is that there'll be a space and a half left, because when people first start to park up these business zones in the morning, they're the only one there. They're parked in the middle of the space. They don't know how many parking spaces they've left ahead and behind. There could be 6 parking spaces on each side of Kinsale Place in that first block, but often there's only 5 or 4 because of people parking randomly along the space instead of in 20-foot parking stalls or 18-foot parallel parking stalls. So that's just some comments about this. If you do put more parking in by restriping and narrowing the traffic lanes on Sub-Zero Parkway, I think it will be severely traffic calming because I don't think there's enough room there for it. We'll see how that works out. I know that's what you're planning to do.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. Okay, and then any other comments on Sub-Zero Parkway before we move on? Okay. Another recent example was Scarlet, and this is really, so this is kind of where the end of the development was previously, so you can kind of see where the road stopped, and then now with Scarlet continuing onto Stoner Prairie, we have this kind of newly created parking issue area. You do see our yellow pavement markings there, or curb markings there. And so really this is kind of a situation where we have a number of factors going on. So we have a curve, we have a crosswalk, we have driveways. And so this is really just a request to clean this up, to extend some of our 15-foot no parkings from crosswalks into driveways, make sure that we're maintaining sight distance around the curve. And so just to kind of back up so everybody can see what this looks like from a bird's eye view. So as I mentioned, this is what the arrow would look like before. Now if we were to go to it, you see that it continues. And so that's kind of created this new issue area. And so certainly something we can look at. Again, according to our current ordinance, we would certainly have the 15-foot that we could paint. And we have the 4 feet from driveway. But anything more than that would have to go to, go to council for a specific ordinance. So certainly just a simple fix, but something that, certainly would take a little bit more effort now to do that, so.
Andrew?
Yep.
What's going on there? Is there parking demand for the park or the school?
Sure.
Or both?
Yep, there definitely is. And so certainly one example would be to just restrict along here to maintain visibility, but not restrict along the park access, so. But yeah, certainly I think there's lots, there's a dynamic area between the school and park and lots of different activities. So we want to make sure we're maintaining as much on-street parking as possible so that we can maintain, usage at that park, but at the same time not obscure the crosswalk there, so.
Street parking in these suburban areas is very valuable because many of the streets are too wide and street parking helps slow the cars down. You will get the contrary thing is like, oh, kids will dart out between the cars and be killed. So we need to be able to see all the way to the curb. but statistically that is not true. The kids are more likely to be killed by speeding cars than by running out between cars and being hit by a slow moving car. So I do think that street parking is a valuable asset for neighborhood traffic calming around these parks.
Sure, that's a good point. Okay. Another example might be, and this is something that several other jurisdictions have enacted in their ordinance, is parking near mailboxes. So this, particular case, there might be a mailbox here adjacent to someone's driveway. Certainly the 4-foot extension from that driveway, no parking prohibition in statute applies here. But in this particular case, if there's 3 parked cars in between these 2 driveways, they're not quite into that 4-foot zone, but they are still blocking the mailbox. And so what some other jurisdictions have done is restrict parking for mailboxes. They've also, some other ones have gone as far as to offer residents up to 4 parking permits to allow their own vehicles to park in front of their mailbox. So, that can definitely, be as complicated or as simple as needed. I would say I haven't heard of a whole lot of these instances. And so I think an alternative might be to just allow these to be one case by case with some, certainly some neighbor mediation as well as some no parking signage. I've certainly had experience with that in other jurisdictions of just putting up one-off no parking signs. We don't want to make a precedent, certainly that we're going to sign every driveway, but it's definitely an option in some of these cases. So those are kind of 2 options: to either do a blanket, citywide no parking from mailboxes for all mailboxes, or to treat individual circumstances based on what they are. So I think both Steves have a comment for this one. Steve Streck, do you want to go first?
I'll go first. I'm sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt. I don't have a comment on this one. I've got another Zoom meeting starting at 7:30, so I have to leave to prepare. But Andrew, how do I follow up with you on this, on the things that we've talked about?
Sure. So you can definitely email me. Otherwise, I'll just skip right to the end just for other folks. Oops, skip a little too far. So I would say, certainly email me, calling me. I will obviously include Officer Hartwick Lieutenant Hartwick on all of these correspondence just to make sure we're all on the same page. But I think the main thing is to sign up for this parking list on Notify Me. That way, everybody's aware of upcoming action to council if we do have specific solutions we want to ask for council to weigh in on. So that's how I would say do that. And then I'll jump back in the presentation. Steve, and thanks for coming, Steve. Appreciate it.
I have to sign off also for 7:30, so
Okay.
I'll get on that Notify Me list.
All right.
Thank
you.
Thanks
Sounds
for
good.
having us.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Yep. Any other comments on mailboxes? All right. And then I do have a question for others, if there are others. So it's hard to sum up all of these ordinances for, it's easy enough for winter parking. For all the other parking, it's a little bit more expansive. So I did, start on this, and so this is what some other cities do. I want to know Madison designates 691 no parking zones in ordinance, and that's specifically the parking prohibited in specific zones. They do have a provision to allow the traffic engineer to establish no parking zones up to 100 feet. Milton primarily lists specific zones in their ordinances, so for all their different full prohibitions and time of day, they have specific zones, and they also do have that mailbox ordinance along with that resident permit system. Stoughton primarily lists specific zones in ordinance. Sun Prairie does include a good list of general parking prohibitions, but also includes specific zones. Verona, again, general and specific. And then Janesville primarily includes these citywide restrictions, including mailboxes and ordinance, but doesn't have specific street zones specified in ordinance. Instead, they just rely on official traffic signage. And they actually have an internal approval system that lets different departments weigh in on a new or change in parking regulations without it specifically going to ordinance necessarily. So that, and so really theirs are just kind of where there's official street signs say there is parking restrictions, so. And so just to kind of clarify, so there's a lot of different things that we talk about in this. I think, certainly there's a number of places where our ordinances don't match up. One possible solution towards that is just, systematically reviewing, bringing a large ordinance change to council, making sure we true up everything in the field that we would like to what our ordinances say. That's certainly an option. Another option would be to change ordinances to allow zones up to, let's say, 300 feet to be designated by the city engineer, with an internal process like Janesville. So that could certainly be an option that would still allow, a good amount of collaboration across city departments and potentially some involvement with boards, commissions, or council, but would potentially lower the bar for some of these changes to make them a little bit easier to update and stay current. Another option would be to establish an official parking zone map on the city website, similar to the map I showed earlier, web-based map that would be reinforced by official traffic signs in the field, but would give folks, a good understanding, not necessarily just in text, but in a visual format that they can understand what parking regulations are, and then maintaining that official map with parking signage to ensure consistency going forward. So those are some options. Again, it's not a panacea. We're not going to solve all the issues, but I think the question we have right now is, can we update some of these processes to make our systems a little bit more efficient and up to date? So are there any comments on that, questions? And Lieutenant Hartwick, did you want to add anything? Sorry.
No, ultimately, we're happy to work with whatever solutions we determine are right for the variety of these issues. And if people have specific questions or concerns related to enforcement, they can certainly reach out to me.
Awesome, thank you. And so with that, I will follow up. So, like I mentioned just a little bit ago, please feel free to sign up for the parking list on Notify Me. That way you can stay up to date with any potential next steps or changes brought to committees and council. I will say, just based upon the attendance tonight, I think it would be great to open up a survey, so we'll have that posted on this link and on the city webpage, just to add an additional mechanism for folks to weigh in on this. Feel free, hopefully this is a learning opportunity to kind of learn about the city ordinances, learn about potential changes. But I think, weighing in online, if you didn't have a chance to make it tonight, we're certainly open to hear more. Please add some of those specific examples and tell us, what's working, what isn't out there. So we can take that feedback and bring it to the council and the committees and see what changes we can make. So with that, I really welcome any questions. Feel free to email me as well. I'll put I'll certainly email out on this list my email address as well as Lieutenant Hartwick's, so that we'll keep those comments coming. So this isn't the end of the discussion, just maybe the start. So with that, I really thank everybody for being here tonight and joining the conversation, and look forward to continuing on. Awesome. Thank you.